When we're talking about building big, strong triceps with just dumbbells, the first thing we have to remember is that the triceps make up about 2/3 of your upper arm size. So if you're chasing sleeve-busting arms, you can't just curl your way there. You've got to hit those triceps directly with intensity, good form, and plenty of smart exercise variation. Now, dumbbells are an excellent tool for this because they allow a more natural range of motion compared to barbells or machines, and they also help balance out strength differences between arms. So let's dive into the approach. First, variety is king. You want to target the triceps through their three main heads: long, lateral, and medial. That means picking exercises that hit them from different angles and at different muscle lengths. Some movements overload the stretch position, think overhead dumbbell extensions, while others overload the shortened position like kickbacks. By combining both, you get a much more complete stimulus for growth. Second, execution has to be on point. Too many people turn dumbbell tricep training into some kind of swinging, momentum-driven mess. Don't cheat your way through it. Control the eccentric pause at the bottom and then extend forcefully but not carelessly. The triceps respond best when the movement is stable, strict, and really focusing on extending at the elbow joint rather than turning it into a shoulder or chest exercise. Third, progressive overload isn't optional. Your triceps will not grow just because you keep showing up and picking up dumbbells. You've got to make the weight, reps, or sets harder over time. That can mean adding a few pounds to your dumbbells, grinding out an extra rep per set, or even adding a whole new set to the workout cycle. If you're not tracking and pushing progression, your arms are going to stay the same size forever. Finally, volume and recovery. Triceps, like any other muscle group, need enough volume to grow, but also enough rest to recover. Somewhere in the range of 10-20 hard sets per week for triceps is where most people grow best. That doesn't mean smashing them with 30 sets in one day. It means distributing that work across your weekly training plan in a sustainable way. And when you pair smart training volume with good recovery, nutrition, sleep, and consistency, you've set yourself up for huge arms over time. So if you're serious about getting bigger triceps with dumbbells, it's not just about random exercises. It's about picking the right mix of movements that target all heads of the triceps, executing them with precision, pushing progressive overload, and managing your training volume so you can recover and keep growing. Do that consistently, and your triceps won't just get stronger, they'll get massive fast. When we talk about building the triceps, the biggest mistake most people make is they think of the muscle as one simple slab that just straightens the arm. And while technically that's true, the triceps brachia has three different heads: the long head, the lateral head, and the medial head. Each of these plays a slightly different role, and if you want to maximize both the strength and the sheer size of your arms, you've got to train all three. Now, when people hear that, they either overcomplicate it or they just ignore it. They'll pick one or two exercises they like, say skull crushers and kickbacks, and they'll do them over and over again. And then 6 months later, they wonder why their triceps haven't really grown much. The truth is, the triceps respond best to a variety of angles and loading positions. That's because each head gets emphasized depending on where your arm is in relation to your torso and how the resistance lines up with your elbow extension. So if you really want those horseshoe triceps that stretch the sleeves of your shirt, you've got to think more strategically. Let's start with the long head, because it's unique. Unlike the other two heads, the long head actually crosses the shoulder joint. What does that mean in practical terms? It means if your arm is overhead, that long head is in a fully stretched position. That's why overhead dumbbell extensions are so brutally effective. When you lower that dumbbell behind your head, the long head is under a ton of stretch and tension. That stretch under load stimulus is one of the most powerful hypertrophy drivers we know of. If you're leaving out overhead work, you're leaving out a ton of growth potential. On the other hand, if your arm is closer to your torso, say during kickbacks or close grip presses, the long head isn't working as hard, but the lateral and medial heads are picking up the slack. So it's not about finding the one best exercise, but about combining movements that together hit all three heads thoroughly. Now let's talk about the lateral head. This is the one that really gives the triceps that outer sweep, that visual pop from the side. It responds really well to heavier compound-like dumbbell movements, such as close grip dumbbell presses, or even dumbbell floor presses. These let you overload the triceps with big weights while still keeping tension where you want it. The lateral head is often most engaged when your arm is closer to your torso, so these kinds of pressing variations can be a great way to grow it. And here's the thing. People often assume that pressing is just a chest exercise. But if you bring your grip in tighter, slow down your reps, and focus on pushing through elbow extension rather than just moving the dumbbell, you'll be surprised at how much tricep stimulus you actually get. The medial head is the one most people forget about, but it's important for full arm thickness and elbow stability. It's active in almost every tricep exercise, but it really shines when you're doing lighter, higher rep work because it helps control and stabilize the joint. Dumbbell kickbacks, strict rope press downs, if you're not limited to dumbbells, or even higher rep overhead extensions can bring it out. The key here is strict execution and not letting your shoulder or torso take over. If you cheat, you're robbing the medial head of its work. And since this head isn't as big or flashy as the other two, people tend to neglect it. But guess what? If your medial head is underdeveloped, you won't get that full balanced look, and your arms will look incomplete. So what's the practical takeaway? If you want big triceps, you don't just throw in 1 or 2 dumbbell moves and hope for the best. You need at least one overhead movement to crush the long head. You need some kind of pressing movement to hit the lateral head with heavier loads. And you need a strict controlled isolation move to nail the medial head and fill in the details. That's how you train the triceps comprehensively. That's how you avoid the mistake of being that guy in the gym who only does one kind of extension and then complains that their arms won't grow. And let's clear up another point. People often say, well, if I just press heavy, won't all the heads get worked anyway? The answer is sort of, but not nearly as well as they could. Yes, all 3 heads contribute to elbow extension, but unless you're positioning your arm in a way that stretches and challenges each head, you're never maximizing its potential. It's like saying, if I just squat, won't my hamstrings grow? Sure, they'll grow a little, but not nearly as much as if you also did Romanian deadlifts and leg curls. Muscles grow best when you hit them multiple angles and with multiple tools. The triceps are no different. Now, one final point that a lot of people overlook: balance matters. If you hammer the long head with overhead work and ignore pressing variations, you'll get some growth, sure, but your triceps won't have that balanced, three-dimensional look. They'll be strong in one position and weak in another. That's not what we're after. What we want is thick, round, powerful triceps that look good from every angle, front, side, and back. That's the payoff of intelligently hitting all 3 heads instead of relying on 1 or 2 favorite exercises. So, in summary, if you want to maximize your triceps growth with dumbbells, the absolute key is to hit all 3 heads. Overhead extensions for the long head, pressing for the lateral head, and strict isolation work for the medial head. Cycle these intelligently into your training, execute them with good form, and progressively overload them over time, and your triceps will not only grow, they'll transform into one of the most impressive muscle groups on your body. When we start talking about execution, this is where the difference between people who get results and people who spin their wheels really shows up. Because here's the reality: you can pick the best exercise on paper, you can have the perfect dumbbell variation lined up, but if you're swinging the weight around, letting momentum do the work, and not actually loading the triceps through their full range of motion, you're not really training the triceps. You're just moving a dumbbell from point A to point B, and that's not the same thing as stimulating growth. Muscles don't care that the weight moved, they care about tension, stretch, contraction, and stability, and that only comes from precise execution. Now, what do I mean by precise execution? First and foremost, control. On the eccentric portion, the lowering of the dumbbell, you have to own that movement. Too many lifters just let the weight drop, thinking the only thing that matters is how hard they push it back up. But here's the thing: a controlled eccentric is one of the most powerful growth stimuli we know. That slow lowering not only maximizes time under tension, but it also prevents your joints from taking unnecessary abuse. If you're crashing the dumbbell down, your elbow joint is eating that force instead of your triceps fibers. So when I say execution matters, I mean literally taking your time on the way down, keeping everything tight and making sure you're loading the triceps and not just surviving the rep. Next, we've got to talk about isolation. The triceps are elbow extensors. That's their job. What that means in practical terms is that your shoulder shouldn't be moving all over the place while you do a triceps exercise. If you're doing a dumbbell kickback and your shoulder is swinging back and forth, congratulations, you're doing some kind of weird rear delt lat shrug hybrid, but you're not really challenging the triceps. Same with overhead extensions. If you're flaring your elbows way out and letting the dumbbell drift into some kind of half chest press, you're robbing your triceps of tension. Good execution means locking in your upper arm, keeping it stable, and letting the elbow do the bending and straightening. Nothing else should be moving. And here's the part most people hate to hear: that usually means lowering the weight. Because yes, you can grab a heavy dumbbell and heave it around, but if you're not actually extending at the elbow through a full range of motion, you're not training harder, you're just training sloppier. The triceps don't care how much weight you picked up, they care how much tension you applied to them. And if dropping the weight by 5 pounds lets you slow down the rep, get a full stretch at the bottom, and a real squeeze at the top, you're going to grow way faster than the guy next to you throwing around twice the load. Now, let's get into the nuance of positioning. For dumbbell triceps work, small changes in angle make a big difference. On overhead extensions where your elbows point can determine whether you're hammering the long head or whether you're just straining your shoulders. Keep them tucked in, control the path of the dumbbell, and focus on pushing up through the elbows, not just getting the weight overhead. On kickbacks, your torso angle matters. If you're too upright, the resistance drops off and the exercise basically turns into holding a dumbbell in space. Lean forward enough that gravity is pulling the dumbbell straight down, and then extend the elbow so the triceps are working through their shortened range. This is the difference between actually training a muscle and just going through the motions. Tempo is another piece of execution that people overlook. A lot of lifters think explosive up, slow down is the rule for every exercise. But for triceps, especially with dumbbells, there's an argument for being controlled both ways. If you're pressing up or extending too explosively, you can easily end up locking out with momentum, which means the top of the movement where the triceps should be working hard basically gets skipped. Instead, think of extending with intent, but not flinging. Push the dumbbell out with steady force, feel the contraction, pause for a split second, and then lower under control. That kind of disciplined tempo absolutely wrecks the triceps in the best way possible. And we have to address range of motion. Half reps might make your ego feel good, but they don't do much for muscle growth. The triceps grow best when they're challenged in both the stretched and shortened positions. That means letting the dumbbell go all the way down behind your head on an overhead extension, feeling that deep stretch, and then pushing it all the way back up until your arms are fully straight. It means not cutting your presses short just because the last few inches are hard. In fact, those last inches are usually where the triceps are working the hardest. If you're skipping that, you're skipping the very stimulus you need. Now, is it uncomfortable? Absolutely. Stretching a muscle under load isn't exactly fun. Pausing at the top of a contraction when your arms are burning isn't easy. But that's the whole point. Muscles grow when you challenge them in the positions they're weakest in. Perfect execution forces you to live in those uncomfortable spots instead of bypassing them with momentum. And that's where the gains come from. So when I talk about execution, I don't mean making your workout fancier or more complicated. I mean stripping it down to the basics and making sure every single rep is actually doing what it's supposed to. Elbows locked in, shoulders quiet, controlled lowering, steady extension, full range of motion. It sounds simple, and it is, but it's not easy. And the difference between someone who builds thick, powerful triceps with dumbbells and someone who stays the same year after year isn't usually exercise selection. It's whether they execute the fundamentals with discipline rep after rep. And here's the best part. Once you master execution, every dumbbell exercise becomes more effective. Overhead extensions hit harder. Kickbacks suddenly feel like the triceps are cramping. Even close grip presses stop feeling like a chest press and start burning the back of your arms. It's not about doing more exercises or chasing heavier dumbbells. It's about making the movements you already have count. That's execution, and that's what separates average arms from massive ones. When it comes to building triceps or any muscle, really, the concept that underpins all of this is progressive overload. Without it, you can have perfect exercise selection, flawless execution, and even good volume, but you'll hit a wall. Your body is an adaptation machine. If you give it the same challenge over and over again, it stops seeing any reason to change. That's why you can't just grab the same pair of 20-pound dumbbells, crank out the same 3 sets of 10 reps, and expect your arms to magically keep growing for years. At some point, your triceps go, "Oh, we've seen this before, we know how to handle this," and they stop adapting. Progressive overload is the signal that tells your body, "Hey, this is harder than last time. You'd better get bigger and stronger to keep up." Now, overload doesn't have to mean slapping another 10 pounds on the dumbbell every workout. That's where people misunderstand it. If that was the case, we'd all be pressing dumbbells the size of cars by now. What overload really means is making your training just a little bit harder over time. That can happen in several ways. The most obvious one, of course, is adding weight. If you overhead extend 25 pounds this week for 3 sets of 12, and in a few weeks you're doing 30 pounds for the same sets and reps, you've overloaded. That's straightforward. But there are other ways to do it that are just as effective, sometimes even more so when you're limited by the dumbbells you have. You can overload by adding reps. So say you stick with those 25s, but instead of 3 sets of 12, now you're cranking out 3 sets of 14. That's overload. You can overload by adding sets going from 3 to 4 sets of work with the same weight and reps. You can overload by adding sets going from 3 to 4 sets of work with the same weight and reps. You can even overload by adding sets going from 3 to forcing your triceps to perform under more fatigue. All of these are ways to keep raising the bar, nudging your muscles out of their comfort zone. Here's the trap most lifters fall into. They confuse effort with progression. Just because the workout feels hard doesn't mean you're overloading. If you're using the same dumbbells for months, but the only thing that changes is that you're grimacing harder and sweating more, your triceps aren't being given a new stimulus. They're just handling the same workload while you get more dramatic about it. Real progression is measurable. You can point to the logbook and say, last month I was doing this, now I'm doing more. That's the discipline piece. If you're not writing down what you're lifting, you're guessing. And if you're guessing, you're leaving growth up to luck. Another mistake is trying to force overload too quickly. You don't need to jump weights every single session. In fact, if you try, you'll just hit a wall and burn out. Overload works best when it's gradual. Think of it as coaxing your body to grow, not shocking it. Add a rep here, add a little weight there, extend the set range slightly over a few weeks. Those small improvements accumulate. You string together months of that, and suddenly your triceps look like they've been inflated with air. But it didn't happen overnight. It was the product of consistent, patient progression. Now let's get specific to dumbbell triceps training, because we're not talking about barbell bench presses where you can microload with little plates. With dumbbells, sometimes the jumps are 5 pounds per hand, which can feel enormous, especially on an isolation movement like a kickback or overhead extension. What do you do when that 5-pound jump feels impossible? This is where rep progression becomes your best friend. Milk as many reps as you can at the lighter weight before you move up. If you can do 3i10 with 20s, push that to 3i14 or 3i15. By the time you finally grab the 25s, you're strong enough to handle them for solid reps, and you don't stall out right away. That's how you use progression intelligently, rather than trying to force it recklessly. Something else that often gets overlooked is that progression doesn't always have to be linear within one exercise. You can rotate exercises and still progress overall. Maybe overhead extensions stall out for a bit, but your close grip dumbbell presses are climbing. That's still progressive overload across the triceps as a muscle group. And when you circle back to the extensions, you might find you're stronger because your pressing went up. That's the beauty of variety paired with overload. They feed into each other. Another point, progressive overload isn't just about numbers, it's also about quality. If you're doing sloppy overhead extensions with your elbows flaring out and your shoulders helping, and then a month later you're doing the same weight but now with stricter form, better elbow positioning, and fuller range of motion, that's progression. Your triceps are taking on more of the load, which means they're being overloaded more effectively. Don't discount that. The logbook doesn't always show it, but your muscles definitely notice. And here's the brutal truth. Without overload, nothing else matters. You can argue about the best dumbbell exercise all day, but if you're not pushing it harder over time, your arms won't change. That's why people who just go through the motions for years look the same year after year. They confuse activity with progress. Overload is progress. It's the single most important principle of muscle growth, and it applies to every muscle group, every tool, every program. So the mindset you need is simple. Every time you pick up those dumbbells, ask yourself, how is this harder than last time? It doesn't have to be drastically harder. It just has to be something. One more rep, one more set, a little bit more weight, a little bit stricter form, stack those small wins, and your triceps will have no choice but to grow. That's how you turn dumbbells into weapons for massive arms. Not by doing the same thing over and over, but by making the work just a little more challenging relentlessly over weeks and months. That's progressive overload, and it's the law of growth. When we start talking about training volume and recovery, this is where the long-term winners in muscle growth really separate from the crowd. Because you can pick great exercises, you can execute them with precision, and you can even overload progressively. But if you're not managing how much work you're doing and how well you're recovering from that work, your growth is going to stall. Muscle building isn't just about hammering the muscle as hard as you can every session. It's about giving it enough stimulus to force adaptation, and then giving it enough rest and resources to actually grow bigger and stronger. Triceps are no exception. Let's first define what we mean by volume. Training volume in practical terms is the number of hard sets you do per week for a given muscle group. And for most people, the triceps grow best somewhere between 10 and 20 hard sets per week. Now, hard sets doesn't mean just going through the motions. It means sets that are taken close to failure, where the triceps are genuinely being pushed to their limits. Anything less than that isn't really sending a strong growth signal. So when I say 10-20 sets, I mean real work, not fluff. There's a tricky part. Some people can grow on the lower end of that range, and some need the higher end, beginners, smaller framed lifters, or people who already get a lot of indirect triceps work from pressing movements might only need 8-12 sets. More advanced lifters, or people who don't do much pressing outside of direct arm training, might need 15-20. The key is finding your own sweet spot where you're training hard enough to grow, but not so much that you're digging yourself into a recovery hole. And that's where most lifters screw up. They either underdo it and wonder why nothing's changing, or they go crazy with 25-30 sets a week and wonder why their elbows feel like they're on fire and their arms aren't growing. Here's the reality. Your triceps aren't going to get huge if you can't recover from the training you're doing. Recovery is just as important as the training itself. Muscles don't grow in the gym. They grow when you're resting, sleeping, and fueling properly. So if you're pounding your triceps with set after set, but you're sleeping 5 hours a night, under eating protein and running yourself into the ground, you're not giving your body the chance to adapt. In fact, you're probably just spinning your wheels, burning calories, and aggravating your joints. This is why a weekly distribution of volume matters. Don't try to cram all 15 sets of triceps work into one marathon arm day. Sure, it feels epic in the moment, but by set 12, your performance is trash and your muscles aren't getting the same quality stimulus. Instead, spread those sets out across the week, hit some triceps after chest day, throw in a few sets after shoulder pressing, and maybe dedicate one smaller session to isolations. That way, each set is higher quality and your triceps are stimulated more frequently, which is a powerful growth driver. Frequency plus quality beats one giant junk volume session every time. Now, let's talk about signs you're not recovering properly. The obvious one is joint pain. If your elbows ache constantly, that's your body telling you it's not keeping up. Another sign is stalled performance. If you're doing the same weight and reps week after week with no progress, it could be because you're simply not recovering well enough to adapt. And then there's the systemic signs: poor sleep, constant fatigue, irritability. People forget that recovery isn't just about the muscle itself, it's about your whole body being able to repair and rebuild. If your lifestyle is trash, your recovery will be trash and your growth will be non-existent. So how do you maximize recovery? First and foremost, sleep. If you're not sleeping 7-9 hours a night consistently, you're handicapping your gains before you even start. Sleep is when growth hormone spikes, when protein synthesis ramps up, when the real rebuilding happens. You can't out-supplement or out-train poor sleep. Next, nutrition. You need enough protein, roughly a gram per pound of body weight for most people, to give your triceps the building blocks they need to grow, and you need enough calories overall. If you're constantly in a calorie deficit, your body isn't going to prioritize building muscle. It's going to prioritize survival. That means your triceps will stay small no matter how many overhead extensions you crank out. Hydration, stress management, and even things like active recovery, light cardio, stretching, mobility work also play a role. None of these are magic on their own, but together they create the environment your muscles need to grow. Think of training as the stimulus and recovery as the construction crew. You can't just keep sending out more and more signals to build if the crew doesn't have enough rest, fuel, and resources to actually do the work. One final point that often gets overlooked: more isn't always better. In fact, once you go past your optimal volume, adding more sets can actually make you smaller over time because you're breaking down tissue faster than you can repair it. This is where ego training kills progress. People think they're hardcore by doing endless sets of triceps work, but if they're not recovering, all they're really doing is sabotaging themselves. The real hardcore lifter is the one who's disciplined enough to stop at the right point, recover fully, and then come back stronger the next week. So the big picture here is simple. Training volume is the dose, recovery is the antidote, and muscle growth is the result of balancing the two. Too little volume, no growth signal. Too much volume, no recovery. The sweet spot in the middle is where the magic happens. And the better you get at listening to your body, tracking your performance, and managing your lifestyle outside the gym, the more consistent your gains will be. That's how you take dumbbell triceps training from just a random collection of exercises to a structured, long-term growth plan. It's not just about the movement. It's about how much of it you do, how often you do it, and how well you recover from it. Nail that balance and your triceps will grow bigger, stronger, and more resilient than ever. Ignore it, and you'll be stuck wondering why all that sweat and grind never seems to show up on your arms.